tomorrow, January 17th, is Martin Luther King Day. And it's great. It's a great thing. It's an important thing that as a society we have on our calendar a day to honor the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's a good thing that we have roads and schools and other things named to honor civil rights leaders like Reverend Dr. King. But all of these honorings and celebrations can sometimes obscure who the man really was and how he was received in his life. Maybe you're familiar with this statistic. Martin Luther King Jr.'s disapproval rating when he was assassinated, a few months before he was assassinated in 1968. In the United States, the percentage of people who disapproved of Martin Luther King Jr. was 75%. If you haven't heard that statistic, it's probably shocking for some of us, 54 years later. And that's because it's shocking to us because of what empires do to past prophets. They honor the memory while obscuring the message. I oftentimes check in on what my kids are learning in school, and there have been times where, it's Martin Luther King Day, and we say, what did you learn about Martin Luther King? And a lot of times it's like, he wanted everyone to be nice to each other. He wanted everyone to get along. And I think, that's not completely untrue, but I think it raises maybe more questions than it answers, right? If Martin Luther King Jr. was just about peace and love and just being nice to each other and getting along, why would anyone want to kill him? And the same could be said for Abraham Lincoln, for Gandhi, even for Nelson Mandela. Though Mandela wasn't killed, it's important to know that he was actually on U.S. terror watch lists until 2008. Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist in this country for most of his life. And so now we honor these people. We have monuments and days and other ways of celebrating them. But many of us have probably lost sight of why they were so unpopular in their day. We sanitize their message. And it's similar to how we sanitize the message of the biblical prophets and the apostles and even Jesus. Right? If the Bible is just about, being a good citizen, being nice to other people, well, how did so many of them end up martyrs? Why did Jesus end up on a cross? Well, the point is, ultimately, that by definition, prophets disrupt us. They introduce us to a new way, a different idea, an alternate vision. And all of those are the really nice ways of saying it, the ways that sound great to us. But there's another term that we could use for all of those things: foreign. Biologically speaking, when a foreign agent is introduced, it is our body's impulse to fight it and dispel it or destroy it. And in fact, autoimmune diseases are so dangerous because our body can't distinguish between our own cells and foreign cells. And so there is something in our bodies, for the sake of survival, that wants to resist, dispel, or destroy what is unfamiliar, what is new, what is foreign. And so it is for us with ideas, foreign ideas that threaten our settled systems of thinking. And so it is with movements that threaten our social status quo. We are, as beings, not just our body, but our brains, are intent on protecting what is familiar, known, and stable. Most of us are not, at least in this moment of our humanity, naturally receptive to the prophetic imagination that introduces foreign concepts and ways into our lives. And so over time, consciously or unconsciously, the strategy of the system in power, whether that is my current paradigm or system of thinking, or whether that's the powers that be in an empire, the strategy is to resist, dispel, or destroy the prophet, and then reshape the prophet's disruptive message into something that is more familiar and comfortable to us. So it has been with King and with Mandela, and indeed with Jesus. Which all brings us to the oddest of contrasts in Mark chapter 3, a text in which multiple people, or should I say beings, respond to the prophetic imagination of Jesus and offer their answers to his central question: who do you say I am? Our reading today is Mark chapter 3, verses 20 through 33. Then Jesus went home, and the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, "He has gone out of his mind." And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, "He has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of demons he casts out demons." And he called them to him and spoke to them in parables. "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself, and he is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Truly I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they had said he has an unclean spirit." Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brother and sisters, they're outside asking for you." And he replied, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise be to you, O Christ. All right, so there's a lot going on in these verses, and we're going to look at 4 groups of beings who respond to Jesus in different ways. Now, the first group is the crowds. And the crowds, honestly, they're crowds. They're not sure what exactly is going on. They're just kind of riding the wave. Lauren and I, this past week, we decided to start. We couldn't really finish it, but we started to start this documentary about the Beatles, and they were showing some scenes of Beatlemania. If you lived during this time, man, I don't even know. But people just going out of their minds if they were anywhere near the Beatles, right? And it's kind of this phenomenon, right? On one hand, they're following him around like my dog when she wants a walk, or they just can't get enough of him. If Jesus were walking around today, everyone would be going around with the phones. They'd be like, "Oh, dude, look, it's Jesus. Look," they just can't leave him alone. They're intrigued. They're curious, right? But on the other hand, they're passing along this message that eventually reaches Jesus's family, and they're kind of like, he's gone out of his mind, we think, right? They don't really know what to do with him. He's intriguing, he's entertaining. They can't look away, but they're just not sure. Then you have the scribes, and this is what we do. This is what people do when our thinking is disrupted, right? Jesus is embodying this other thing that they just can't explain, right? And so what happens when that happens to us is we tend to make huge logical leaps to justify our feelings of discomfort, right? The scribes are seeing all of this evidence that God is doing something different than they expected, right? They can't deny that something spiritual is going on. People are being healed, demons are being cast out, right? So the only logical option left for them, beyond just receiving that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, as we read last week, beyond that, the only logical option that they can even come up with is Beelzebul. He's Beelzebul. And we're not exactly sure where this name or phrase comes from, but it's definitely connected with what they say next, that he's the chief of demons or the devil. And this is what we do, right? When we're really down to it, when we really don't want to accept truth, we'll go to do all kinds of logical gymnastics, right? But Jesus basically points this out, and he says, first of all, this is just logically ridiculous. Casting out demons of people, healing, freeing, that's the opposite of evil, what evil desires, right? That's the opposite of what the devil desires. It doesn't even make sense. A house divided against itself cannot stand. But he also warns them, and there's kind of a lament here, a grief, I think, that, these scribes are in a grave state, right? This is not just that they're looking at Jesus and thinking, nah, I don't think he's the Messiah. They are watching demons be cast out and people being healed and liberated and calling it the work of the devil. Indeed, you might even say that they are the ones, in this case, manifesting the spirit of Satan. Satan means the accuser. They're the ones accusing Jesus of being the devil. And so Jesus says, this is, how can you ultimately even receive forgiveness? If you can't even recognize what good is, what is of God? We could spend a longer time on the idea of the unforgivable sin, and honestly, that idea has been misused in so many ways in churches. But let's just simply note here. The question is, how can you even ask forgiveness from a merciful God when you think that the very liberating, forgiving, healing work of that God is actually evil itself? And Jesus is just saying this is a painful state for the soul to be in. And so if Jesus had point blank asked the scribes the question that he asks the disciples later on, "Who do you say I am?" they would have replied, "Beelzebul, chief of demons," or at the very least an agent of evil or an idolater. And so here we have this prophetic divide. What we noted in King and Mandela and Gandhi, when the little guy stands with integrity, face to face with the empire, or other deluded, oppressive, or fear-filled systems. When that happens, there is conflict, drama, there's a divide, and this is lamentable, but in some ways, it's expected. That's the tradition of the prophets, as Jesus points it out. This is what you did to the prophets before me, right? As I noted earlier, it's how we naturally respond to something that disrupts our self-understanding or our understanding of how the world works or where we fit in the world. When something foreign invades. And so it's kind of expected that we would get this from the scribes. But then we have our third group, Jesus' family, right? And I think at the very least we could say they're concerned. And we don't know the inner workings of their minds, but maybe we can take a moment to just imagine what they might have been thinking in this moment. Because we know that the scribes, and remember the scribes are people with some clout within Jewish society. They're calling him the devil. We know that the people are saying, some of the people at least are saying, yeah, he's kind of lost his marbles. And maybe they're thinking, the worst case for them, for his family, is they think he really has lost it. Maybe they heard these promises about who he was going to be before he was even born, and they were excited, and he always was a little different, right? And maybe though they think that at this point it has all been just too much for him. Or maybe they're a little concerned for their family's honor. This is an honor-shame culture. After all, people were saying, right? That phrase is the worst. People are saying. But they're hearing people whispering or just outright mocking Jesus. And in their culture, that's a reflection on them too. So when these people are saying, we think he might have lost his mind, right? Maybe they're hearing, what kind of mother are you? Or what kind of family allows this to go on? Or perhaps they just see that things aren't going well. It's getting heated. Jesus has made enemies of the people that are supposed to be on his side, his fellow Jews. It just isn't working out. Maybe it's time to regroup, or maybe just trying was good enough. But we know, as if you're a parent, you know that impulse. Even if your child believes there is something worth suffering for, even dying for, you don't want them to do it. They're coming to protect him, to get him back to a place where he can feel safe and loved and cared for. Who do they say Jesus is? He's their son. He's their brother. So we have the crowds. Back and forth as crowds are. They love the spectacle and the miracles. Jesus is entertaining. Maybe they're hoping that finally they'll have a shot against defeating Rome with an army, but they're also wondering if he's a little crazy. Then we have the scribes, who are so twisted around, caught up in their own systems of thinking and positions of privilege, that they think he's the devil. And then we have his family, who think he's just a guy who needs to take a step back and reset. But I've kind of withheld the kicker. I said there'd be 4 groups, and I've been careful to not call all of our groups of people, because there's one more in Mark 3, and we're going to go back to verses 9 through 12 to read their response. Jesus told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, so that they would not crush him. For he had cured many, so that all who had diseases pressed upon him to touch him. Whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and shouted, "You are the Son of God." But he sternly ordered them not to make him known. So we have the demons, the unclean spirits, as opposed to the Holy Spirit. Now remember back in chapter 1, Mark starts off his gospel telling us that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And then in Jesus' baptism, God's voice speaks and calls Jesus his beloved son. Well, here in chapter 3, of his own people, his own religious leaders, even of his own family, it is only the demons who echo Mark's and God's assessment of who Jesus is. Maybe it's because there's no need for pretense, right? They know who Jesus is. He knows who they are. They're not fooling anyone. Jesus has already faced the spiritual temptations in the wilderness and the attempts at deception. And in a sense, that's the key to seeing Jesus, right? There's no more battle to be fought. There's no more game to be played. And you just see what is in front of you. But it's also not just about having the right answers, as we have already said. Obviously, it's not just about having the right answers, because the only ones who have the right answer here in this whole chapter are the demons. James picks up on this in James chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. He says, "But someone will say, 'You have faith and I have works.' Well, show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith." He says, "You believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder." It's almost like James is recalling this dynamic of Jesus' ministry as he looks at the Christians of his community. Yeah, we have the answers about Jesus, which only means we're as enlightened as the demons, right? So, friends, it's not just about knowing who Jesus is. It's about trusting in Jesus to be for us who he is. It's relating to Jesus as the Messiah, the one who proclaims good news to the poor, who liberates the captives, who binds up the brokenhearted, and in this way saves the world. It's less about listing off names for Jesus and more about enlisting for the new life that the Son of God is showing and giving to us. And so on one hand, and this is going to be a long one hand, as we read chapter 3, we're chastened, we're humbled. We face the limits of our own spiritual vision and understanding. Right? If the people who were physically in Jesus' presence and witnessing his miracles have trouble seeing who Jesus really is, I think we have to wonder, what might be keeping me from seeing Jesus as he really is? And I have 3 answers to that question. What are the things that keep us from seeing Jesus for who he really is? The first one is our culture. In our culture, part of culture is that we share, in some sense, assumptions about how the world works, about what is necessary, about how people should act, and etc. These are assumptions. Most of them aren't conscious. We don't think of them. We don't articulate them. We weren't just taught them from a young age. We absorbed them from birth. It's the lens through which we see the world. And I've said before, and I know it's hard to hear, but I deeply believe that American nationalism is one of those cultural lenses for us American Christians that severely corrupts our ability to see Jesus. And it's hard to see for us. It's like a fish realizing they're in water, because we've also been taught that we're a Christian nation. But remember, what does the empire do with prophets? They sanitize, they get rid of them first. We didn't have to do that. They sanitize and co-opt their message. They focus on the individual while maintaining the status quo patterns of the empire. They emphasize this king from the distant past with no intention on giving up their kingdom. And so it's not that we don't have the answers. We have the answers in our culture about Jesus in many ways. At least Christians do. It's that we understand the answers within the framework of the most powerful and wealthy empire the world has ever known. What we do is we fit Jesus into the empire assumptions and empire categories. Now, even before the United States was a thing, Christianity, in so many cases, was co-opted by the worldviews of empire. That Jesus was the one who made certain people superior, more worthy to rule and conquer, and was the key to prosperity. He was taken and said, yeah, he's the king, he's the Son of God, and because we believe in him, Jesus will give us heavenly delights for eternity, and we should just leave the world to its natural order, or else. And so our cultural assumptions and lenses can corrupt our view of Jesus, especially when they are coming from the bigger the empire, the more powerful that storytelling, the more difficult it is to even recognize that that's the story. So our cultural assumptions and lenses can corrupt our view of Jesus. But also, secondly, our religious or church assumptions can also do that. We have to see here in this text that the very people who studied and knew all the answers about the Bible of their day, not only, these are the scribes I'm talking about, not only couldn't recognize the Son of God, but actually accused him of being the devil. Right? Just having the Bible, just having the answers that you think the Bible tells you doesn't mean that you recognize and see Jesus clearly. A lot of churches today teach the Bible and say lots of things about Jesus, but that is not the same as truly seeing and knowing and being immersed in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Oftentimes, the Jesus the church talks about is the Jesus shaped by those cultural empire categories and patterns. Again, because we know about Jesus, our voice should be privileged, our belief should be law, and we have a right to be in charge because we have the right answers about God. And friends, that is the kind of story about Jesus that people tell if their primary interest is maintaining the status quo, maintaining or grasping for wealth or power or social privilege. It's what empires do. It's the kind of story that empires tell about prophets like Jesus. And over time, this is the story about Jesus that seeps down even to those who don't have the power or the prosperity or the privilege. It becomes the very lens through which we read the Bible and see Jesus. And God knows I don't get it all either. The lenses I see Jesus through are also limited. And I find myself chastened and warned by these stories in Mark. I find myself asking myself, in what ways have I inherited and trusted in a Jesus who is really a puppet of the empire, who really serves the wishes of the wealthy and powerful, who isn't allowed to disrupt my assumptions or allegiances or agendas? Do you wonder this sometimes? There's a bit of a hack for these first two, for the cultural and religious assumptions that corrupt our views of seeing Jesus. And that hack is to try to look at Jesus through other eyes, other lenses. Many of the spiritual assumptions we make in our church traditions, ours, are not the same assumptions made by, in our case, African American church traditions, Asian churches, South American churches, let alone medieval churches or the first Christians themselves. And so it really helps to read widely and learn from different traditions, because it can help us to notice what just comes from our culture and tradition, and what are those true gospel seeds that the church shares and which we rejoice in as sisters and brothers in Christ. And it is especially helpful to look through the lenses of the poor, the grieving, the vulnerable. All of those, Jesus says, are blessed in the Sermon on the Mount. Why? Because they have a better view of empire and the shadows that empire casts. They have less to lose, frankly, if the status quo is disrupted. So that's kind of the little hack for trying to expose the cultural and religious assumptions that might obscure Jesus for us. But finally, third, our trauma and fear corrupt our vision of Jesus. Jesus is a prophetic disruptor. The more we have experienced painful and malevolent disruption in our lives, abuse, tragedy, unexpected loss, and so on, if we have not had help in processing and coding all of those experiences in grace and healing and love, we end up without any toleration for any disruption, even the kind that liberates. Any disruption feels just too scary for us. It's like our dog, Annie. Annie, I've got a picture of her right here because you're tired of looking at my face, right? Annie had very likely been abused and abandoned before we got her. And when we first got her, many of you have probably had this experience with pets. When we first got her, we would try to pet her just in love. And she would shy away and she would avoid. She couldn't distinguish between abusive touches and adoring touches. She couldn't tell the difference between humans spewing their trauma onto her in violence and humans trying to share their love with her in gentleness. And all of us have this struggle to a greater or lesser extent, depending on how severe our trauma history is. And not just ours, honestly, but the trauma histories of our parents and even our culture and our tribe. And how well or poorly we've had help to metabolize that trauma into resilience and wisdom. All of us have this struggle of distinguishing disruption and what is good disruption and what is just painful and toxic disruption. And all of this impacts how we are able to recognize and receive Jesus. So that all was a little excursus that began with, on one hand, as we read chapter 3, we're chastened, we're humbled, we face the limits of our own spiritual vision and understanding. And perhaps in that little excursus, there's some questions brewing in you about, what is limiting my view, right? But there's another hand, thankfully. And the other hand is that we find hope, I think, in the foolishness of the other human beings in this story. They don't get it at all. They don't know. They don't get Jesus. They get Jesus less than the demons get Jesus, right? But they're in the struggle. They don't know whether he's the warrior king sent by God to raise up Israel and shatter Rome, or if he's kind of lost his marbles. Fair enough. And spoiler alert, not one disciple in the gospel calls Jesus Son of God. Not one of his disciples, not one Jew in the Gospel of Mark calls Jesus the Son of God. So if the main plot line of Mark's gospel is the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, well, the primary subplot is the absolute failure of the disciples to have a clue as to who he really is and what Jesus is doing. And maybe that will give us just a little bit of hope. It should give us hope when we're asking those hard questions about how much our view of Jesus has been shaped by culture and empire and trauma. It should give us hope when we don't have all the answers. It should give us hope when we feel prophetic disruption, even when it is our faith that is being prophetically disrupted. Because this isn't about having all the right answers. It's about being near Jesus and staying in the struggle. It's not about finally grabbing the right answer like one of those claw machines that picks up toys at the arcade. Right? You know these things? And you try, and when you finally grab one, I'm telling you, no kid has ever prayed as hard than in those few seconds when the claw pulls up a toy and then jerks at the top to a stop and then starts sliding over to the chute. Just hoping and praying that claw will hold on. That is not what faith is. It is not just trying to cling to whatever we can to believe so that hopefully we still believe in Jesus when we die and we can go to heaven. That's not what it is. It's not what following Jesus is. Following Jesus is more like just casting ourselves upon a God who has opened his arms wide and said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." It's like letting ourselves be plunged into a river and then trusting that whatever shifts or disruptions or sufferings we endure, whatever ways we've strayed from a life of love of God and neighbor, we are soaked in grace, held in love, welcomed at the table. And in that grace, in that love, at that table, there is life. There is good, abundant, eternal life. It's not about having all the answers. It's about staying soaked in that grace and trusting God to reshape us in the image of Jesus, in the image of love. So who do you say that Jesus is? And what does that mean for your life? Take some time, ponder, wonder, trust God enough to hold your answers to those questions loosely and see what new dimensions of the divine mystery made known in Christ you may discover. Amen.